In war, the moment of silence before the first strike often hides more violence than the strike itself. It is not the explosions that define the beginning, but the long breath held by a soldier staring out into the desert, waiting for the unknown. On the 10th of April, 2003, the runway outside Ali Al Salem Air Base in Kuwait buzzed with activity. American F-16S howled into the sky while C-130 Hercules aircraft, bloated with ammunition and medical supplies, lumbered forward on their final checks. Inside the makeshift tents nearby, a group of coalition soldiers sat around a foldable plastic table, flicking cards onto the dusty surface. The game wasn't about money. It was about faces. Faces of men they would soon be ordered to kill or capture. Printed on each card was a member of Saddam Hussein's regime. The ace of spades, Saddam himself. It would be easy to believe this was just bravado, but beneath the soldier smiles, there was a grim awareness. Iraq was a country about to be shattered, and history would not forgive what followed. Royal flush. The Australian soldier said, it was fitting. The whole war, some believed, was being played like a high-stakes poker game, one in which the West had gone all in on a single belief that removing Saddam Hussein would bring order to chaos. What followed instead was a descent into something far darker. The 2003 invasion of Iraq was never just about weapons of mass destruction, though that's what the world was told. After the 1991 Gulf War, Iraq was a nation smoldering under sanctions and international scrutiny. American and British aircraft patrolled no-fly zones over its northern and southern regions, enforcing terms Saddam's regime resented. Oil exports were tightly controlled, military sites were bombed, and U.S. intelligence services began quietly funneling money to Iraqi opposition groups. But the real turning point came on a clear September morning in 2001. When the towers fell in New York City, the world's most powerful nation was wounded not just physically, but ideologically. President George W. Bush declared a new kind of war. A war not on a country, but on an idea, terror. And any nation that harbored it. Afghanistan came first. Iraq was next. Though no link between Saddam Hussein and the 911 attacks was ever proven, his refusal to cooperate with UN weapons inspectors, his brutal crackdowns on minorities, and his defiant posture toward the West made him an irresistible target. In October 1998, the U.S. passed the Iraq Liberation Act. Its goal was regime change. By early 2003, the Bush administration had begun constructing its case to the world. Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. He was harboring terrorists. He posed an imminent threat. But behind closed doors, the decision had already been made. CIA operatives were on the ground months before the first missile launch. They had forged alliances with the Kurdish Peshmerga in the north and identified high-value targets in Baghdad. When the war finally came, it would come fast. And so, without UN approval, and despite the largest protest in human history, with over 6 million voices in 800 cities crying out against war, the invasion began on the 19th of March. 2003. They called it shock and awe. The doctrine was simple. Overwhelm the enemy, cripple leadership, strike fast, and the rest would fall apart. Coalition forces launched a dual-pronged assault from Kuwait. Meanwhile, special operations teams, American, British, Polish, and Australian hit key oil infrastructure in the Al Faw Peninsula. Offshore rigs were secured before they could be set aflame. Saddam's ecological revenge, feared by many, was narrowly avoided. But things did not go smoothly everywhere. The British Special Air Service, attacking a suspected chemical weapon site near the Syrian border, faced fierce resistance and had to call in an airstrike, obliterating the evidence of whatever had been there. In Baghdad's Dura farms, 40 Tomahawk cruise missiles and 8,000 pounds of explosives rained down to kill Saddam. He wasn't there. He hadn't been for nearly a decade. Civilian casualties mounted. The intelligence was wrong. And the world was watching. Yet still the coalition advanced. A key engagement unfolded in the dusty city of Nasiriyah. An American maintenance convoy took a wrong turn into Iraqi Third Corps territory and was ambushed. 18 soldiers were killed or captured. The U.S. Marines responded with overwhelming force, storming the city and securing the bridges. The battle was brutal. 6 Marines died from friendly fire when an A-10 mistakenly struck their vehicle, but Nasiriyah fell. Then came Najaf, strategically crucial for its position near highways leading to Baghdad. The 1st Brigade combat team seized its bridges through close-quarters combat and blistering assaults. Tanks rumbled over mine-strewn roads. Iraqi engineers tried blowing the bridges. They failed. On the 4th of April, Najaf fell. To the south, British forces besieged Basra. Iraqi resistance was surprisingly fierce. But when the city finally collapsed, residents greeted the troops with flowers and cheers, briefly echoing Secretary Rumsfeld's predictions. Then the looting began. Televisions, refrigerators, artwork all dragged into the street by jubilant, desperate Iraqis. The thin line between liberation and chaos had already begun to blur. At the Karbala Gap, a narrow stretch between 2 rivers, Saddam's Republican Guard mounted their last stand. But a fatal mistake by his son Qusay had stripped the region of reinforcements. American forces punched through on the 1st of April. By the 3rd of April, they had crossed the Euphrates. Colonel David Perkins, sensing the enemy's disarray, launched the infamous Thunder Run, a straight tank charge into Baghdad's southern sectors. It was a gamble, but it worked. On the 7th of April, his tanks roared into the city center. The next day, Saddam's statue came crashing down, captured by cameras, transmitted worldwide. A symbol of triumph, or so it seemed, because Saddam Hussein was gone. His generals had vanished, and the power vacuum was real. Soon after, looters swept the capital. Police stations, government buildings, museums, even hospitals were ransacked. No order, no leadership, just fire and fear. On May 1st, 2003, President Bush landed aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln under a banner that read, "Mission accomplished." He declared that major combat operations in Iraq had ended. In hindsight, that banner would come to symbolize not victory, but naivete. Because the war was not over. It had just changed its face. When a regime falls, so too does the illusion of control. In the immediate days after Baghdad's collapse, coalition troops tried to present themselves as liberators. Yet as tanks rolled through ruined neighborhoods, as children picked through smoldering trash heaps, and as civilians were forced to arm themselves just to guard their own homes, the illusion began to break. There was no functioning police force, no civil administration, no plan. Muhammad Abbas, a shopkeeper who had fled the city, recalled the moment he returned. When I got back to Baghdad, it was not the city I had left just a week before. People walking everywhere with stolen goods, no police, no government, nothing. Baghdad had become a ghost city filled with noise, cries of the looted, gunshots in alleyways, tires burning under bridges. For a war that had begun with surgical precision, the post-war was a free fall into entropy. And in the power vacuum left behind, New actors stepped in. Shia militias, long oppressed under Saddam's Sunni-dominated regime, began to assert control in neighborhoods across the capital. Sunni Ba'athist loyalists, once fearful, regrouped in the shadows. Caught between them, American troops were seen not as peacekeepers but as occupiers. And there was another detail that would prove to be catastrophic. The decision to dismantle the Iraqi army, the Baathification. It sounded bureaucratic. It was anything but. Tens of thousands of former soldiers, officers, administrators, men with weapons, training, and deep grudges were told they had no role in the new Iraq. They were not just fired, they were erased. The result was both immediate and devastating. These men did not disappear. Many became insurgents. Others offered their services to the highest bidder, often foreign fighters or religious extremists. The seeds of the insurgency were planted not by an enemy, but by an ally's miscalculation. There was another war under the surface, not against the Americans, but between Iraqis themselves. The divide between Sunni and Shia Muslims had been decades in the making, but it erupted into full view after Saddam's fall. His regime had systematically repressed Iraq's Shia majority. Now, the pendulum swung hard in the other direction. The U.S. backed Iraqi Governing Council, hastily assembled, was composed of 13 Shias, 10 Sunnis, 5 of them Kurds, and no consensus. The move, intended to reflect demographic realities, instead ignited accusations of betrayal. Sunni bureaucrats were sidelined. Clerics began preaching about the return of the Mahdi. Armed men with no rank and no uniforms began patrolling neighborhoods. Revenge killing surged. Disappearances became daily news. What the U.S. misunderstood, perhaps fatally, was that Iraq was never a blank canvas. It was already painted in sectarian lines, blood-stained history, and foreign betrayal. Even worse were the perceived desecrations. In early 2004, a raid on a mosque, known to be harboring weapons caches, created a national outcry. Though the target was legitimate, the imam had openly preached against American troops and provided bomb-making lessons. The image of shattered Qurans and bloody carpets broke whatever fragile trust remained. American troops offered no apology. They published a list of seized explosives and called it a success. Extremist clerics called it war against Islam. They were believed as American troops went house to house, searching for Ba'athist fugitives. A quiet revolution was taking place, not in the streets, but in basements, tents, and madrasas. The Sunni insurgency was born not from ideology, but from desperation. Meanwhile, Shia militias, supported in part by Iran, consolidated power in cities like Basra and Najaf. What began as political jockeying turned into assassinations, mortar attacks, and battles for neighborhood control. Each explosion deepened the rift, and every coalition casualty was a propaganda victory for the other side. Into this chaos, the CIA made what it considered a pragmatic decision to quietly rehire elements of Saddam's old intelligence services. The logic was simple. These men knew how to control Iraq. They had kept a lid on extremism before. Perhaps they could do it again this time, in service of the United States. But in doing so, the coalition recreated the very machinery that had once propped up Saddam. To the Iraqi people, the message was clear. Nothing had changed. By 2005, Iraq was no longer a war zone. It was a battlefield carved up by militias, foreign fighters, mercenaries, and gangsters. Baghdad became a city of walls. Sunni neighborhoods were bordered by blast barriers. Shia districts guarded by checkpoints. Movement between them could be fatal. And amid it all, American troops were ordered to maintain stability. They could barely maintain their own safety. By 2006, the Civil War was in full bloom. Sunni death squads roamed the night. Shia militias responded in kind. Mosques were bombed. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Funerals became hunting grounds. Over 2 million Iraqis fled their homes. Thousands were killed each month. And still, the U.S. administration resisted, calling it a civil war. Instead, they called it sectarian violence. To those who had seen their children abducted, their homes burned, and their prayers interrupted by gunfire, such euphemisms were salt in the wound. As the center of Iraq collapsed into chaos, the periphery burned with purpose. In the vacuum left by a fallen dictator and a paralyzed occupation force, a new threat emerged: al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by the Jordanian-born militant Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. His vision was simple: provoke civil war, destroy the occupation's legitimacy, and claim Iraq as a bastion of jihad. Zarqawi's methods were far from subtle. Beheadings were recorded in broadcast. Suicide bombers struck marketplaces, mosques, and military convoys indiscriminately. The attacks weren't just against the Americans. They were meant to provoke the Shia, to stoke rage, to force retaliation. And it worked. His insurgency was ruthless, calculating, and media savvy. When U.S. forces hit one safe house, 2 more would spring up. When one lieutenant was killed, another, even more extreme, would take his place. American intelligence knew it could not win by bullets alone, so it tried hearts and minds. But in a country where foreign boots had become a daily humiliation, where electricity came sporadically and safety was a myth, such promises rang hollow. One Iraqi man summed it up: "They gave us democracy, but we cannot walk to vote without risking death." By 2007, the entire nation felt like a crucible. The Americans launched the surge, flooding Iraq with over 200,000 additional troops, increasing patrols, funding local militias, and supporting reconstruction. It bought time, but it did not buy peace. By the end of 2008, the war had consumed over 4,000 American lives, cost over $1 trillion, and claimed the lives of more than 100,000 Iraqi civilians, a number some estimates place far higher. And what had it achieved? Saddam Hussein had been captured in December 2003, pulled from a hole in the ground near Tikrit, bearded, haggard, and defeated. He was tried and hanged in 2006. But his death brought no peace. Instead, it triggered a rebalancing of power so violent, so unmoored, that by the time American troops officially withdrew in 2011, Iraq was left in the grip of constant instability. Even the provisional democracy the U.S. had tried to establish became a source of friction. Elections were plagued with sectarian interference. Shia-aligned politicians dominated the government. Sunnis cried foul. Kurds pushed for autonomy. Iran crept into the vacuum. The CIA, once so confident in its cold logic, found itself again scrambling to control chaos of its own making. Then came 2014. Like a ghost rising from the grave, a new flag appeared, black, adorned with white Arabic script. ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, born from the ashes of Saddam's Iraq and fueled by the rage of disenfranchised Sunnis and radical jihadists from across the world. They seized Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq. Without resistance, Entire divisions of Iraqi soldiers fled. American-made weapons, vehicles, and bases were now in enemy hands. Suddenly, the war was back, and this time, it was worse. U.S. forces returned not as invaders, but as desperate allies to a struggling Iraqi state. It was a grim irony, and the same ground over which American tanks had rolled victoriously in 2003 was now being defended against an enemy far more ideologically dangerous than Saddam Hussein had ever been. Looking back, the 2003 Iraq War reads like a tragedy in 3 acts: swift victory, catastrophic occupation, and enduring chaos. For the soldiers who fought, for the civilians who endured, and for the world that watched in horror, the consequences remain heavy. Some blame flawed intelligence. Others blame the arrogance of American power. Still others point to the naivety of trying to impose democracy in a fractured land built not on unity, but on the memory of empire, tribe, and blood. But the war did something else too, something less visible, but just as profound. It shattered the trust between governments and citizens in the West. The justifications for war were questioned, then debunked. Weapons of mass destruction were never found. Ties to Al-Qaeda were never proven. The images of the torture chambers in Abu Ghraib, the chaos in Fallujah, the civilian dead all became symbols, not of liberation, but of hubris. Even among those Iraqis who once welcomed the fall of Saddam, there remains the bitter aftertaste of what came after. For many, America did not bring freedom. It brought a mirror, and what they saw reflected back was fire, rubble, and the dark depths of a nation torn open. Today, Iraq stands barely as a fragile parliamentary democracy. Elections are held, roads are rebuilt, ISIS has lost its territorial stronghold, but scar run deep, the Sunni-Shia divide still festers, corruption plagues the government, foreign influence is ever present. Iran's reach stretches deep into Iraqi politics. American presence, though diminished, still lingers in the form of advisors and airstrikes. And the question remains, was it worth it? No one can answer that without pain. Some say Saddam's removal was necessary. Others say the method of his removal was unforgivable. Many simply ask whether a different future, one that avoided occupation, that respected Iraq's complexity, that listened instead of dictated, was ever considered. We do not end this story with closure, because history doesn't offer closure. It only offers perspective. And in the story of Iraq, that perspective is still shifting with every generation. Perhaps the lesson is not whether wars are just or unjust. Perhaps the lesson is whether we truly understand the world we try to remake. Empires fall with sound, but they rise with silence. Not with fanfare, but with whispers behind closed doors, with signatures on orders, with broadcasts of certainty spoken over uncertain terrain. The 2003 invasion of Iraq was not just a war. It was a mirror held up to the modern world, revealing the fragility of power, the weight of consequence, and the deep human cost of misunderstood ambition. We often tell ourselves that history is written by the victors, but in Iraq, victory proved to be an illusion. The pen passed instead to the survivors, the families rebuilding their homes, the journalists chronicling the loss, and the children who never knew Saddam but were born into the ruins he left behind, and the soldiers, American, British, Polish, Australian, who walked into Iraq thinking they were writing a new chapter, only to find themselves trapped in an old book, one written in sand, blood, and memory. The war's aftermath raised questions no banner could answer. What is liberation without justice? What is democracy without understanding? What is peace without planning for the day after? Perhaps the final legacy of the Iraq War is that it defies neat conclusions. It resists the tidy narratives of strategy and statistics. It insists on reminding us that the hardest part of toppling a tyrant is deciding who or what takes his place, and maybe, just maybe, the greatest victories in history are the ones that never require war at all. If you found this story moving, if you believe history deserves to be told honestly, calmly, and without censorship, consider joining us here at Legacy Files. Every week, we dive into the untold layers of our past with no ads, no clickbait, and no agenda but truth. Because the past is not over, it lives with us. In every decision we make. Thank you for watching.